Pokemon has always been my favorite franchise. I have sunk countless hours exploring the various regions, shiny hunting, and building competitive teams. I remember being so excited to see the new games get announced and then waking up early morning on release day to play them. Every mainline Pokemon game felt like a genuine improvement over the last. At least, that's how it was until they made the move to the Nintendo Switch. The games we received here are just lazy and rushed cash grabs. And this isn't a jab at Gamefreak, I just want my favorite franchise to receive the same love and care that other Nintendo franchises like Zelda and Mario do. When the Nintendo Switch originally released, it was revolutionary for every franchise. Look at Breath of the Wild. It was a fully open world game in which you could choose the order you fought every boss. There was so much customization that you could play the game over and over and have a different experience. You could even head straight to the final boss if you wanted to. Granted, it wasn't recommended, but you could do that. Breath of the Wild is highly regarded as not only one of the best Zelda games of all time, but also one of the best games in general. Then we had the release of Mario Odyssey, which introduced Cappy and the capture mechanic. It built upon the 3D Mario formula and shook things up completely with the capture mechanic. It also had some of the best platforming we had seen in all of video gaming, combining both 3D and 2D elements. Within the first year of release, the Nintendo Switch was already establishing itself as the console that revolutionized franchises. I remember eagerly waiting for the next Pokemon game to be announced, and I didn't have to wait long because May 29th we received our first look at Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. And at first, I was optimistic. It was the first time a mainline Pokemon game was coming to the big screen. But this game wasn't a mainline Pokemon experience that we were imagining. This title was meant to introduce Pokemon Go players to the mainline games. The game was much simpler than other games. It removed wild battles and replaced them with a Pokemon Go style catch system. There were also no abilities or held items, but despite this, I actually enjoyed this title. The world looked very vibrant and the remastered music was a great addition. And I loved how the Pokemon were actually scaled properly in the overworld and in battle. But I wish I could say the same for what came next. Pokemon Sword and Shield, the move to the next generation, the first mainline Pokemon game on the Nintendo Switch, and to put it bluntly, the game was just boring and lacked ambition. I'm going to break down my issues into three components: the pacing, the environment, and the generation changes with the Pokemon. One of the big issues I had with the game right away was the constant hand-holding. I kid you not, this game took me over a year to play because playing it just felt so draining. You would arrive to a new town and just have Hop hold your hand through it all, telling you what to do. Then there was the route design. Despite it looking more open, this was probably the most linear game in the entire series. Literally look at the map. You start down here, and this is where it ends. It's literally one big straightaway. And then we had the towns, which despite looking huge and full of life, were just dull backdrops with only a few buildings you could actually enter. For example, let's take a look at Hammerlock. How many buildings do you think you can enter and interact with? The answer is 12. And this might seem like a lot, but one of those is a gym, 2 of those are a Pokemon Center, and 3 of those are cosmetic item stores. Now you might be thinking, well, there are still 6 buildings we can enter and explore, and you're right. But the thing is that all of these are pretty much the same building, just copied and pasted over. A lot of the buildings are just hit with the landlord special, with a simple different color exterior. On top of that, a lot of the towns had a ton of fake doors, which wouldn't have mattered as much if the buildings we could enter had more personality to them. These type of things weren't too jarring in the 2D games, but it really sticks out at you in 3D. This game also introduced the wild area, which was supposed to be an open world portion of the game with changing environments and weather and all that cool stuff, and this place just ran like absolute dog water. Pokemon would pop in left and right, which there was even an added sound effect for this. The frame rate wasn't consistent, and it was just super barren, which was a problem that carried over to future games. The game also wasn't graphically impressive. A lot of the textures looked blurry and just unpolished, and I know some of you will blame the hardware limitations of the Switch, but that wasn't it. Look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Those games were huge and did so many crazy things, and yet they looked phenomenal and were able to run fine. Sure, they had barren landscapes at times, but it fit the game's narrative and story. Exploration was fun and rewarding. Tears of the Kingdom had so many mini-bosses, bokoblin camps, shrines, and other things to keep you interested. Another big issue with this game and every Pokemon game moving forward was the static Pokemon. Pokemon Sword and Shield's wild area was just bland. Pokemon would be there roaming around, but that's about it. They were literally just there as NPCs pretty much. I would have loved to see a wild area be something like the Monster Hunter games, where it's lively and actually looks wild, as the name suggests, where you can see creatures fighting each other, running away, interacting with the environment, things like that. This game also had the bright idea to cut the obeyable Pokemon as well. You remember the famous tagline for Pokemon, "Gotta catch 'em all"? Well, if you played these games, that was literally impossible. I never understood this. X and Y had something similar, but then they introduced the Pokebank and allowed you to transfer Pokemon from earlier generations onto Pokemon X and Y. Every single Pokemon was available. This game just straight up made them unavailable because get this, they wanted to focus on updating the animations and models of the Pokemon to the new HD hardware, which look, totally understandable so long as then when they do have those models, they release the Pokemon in a form of free DLC. Oh wait, that never happened. Oh, and you're telling me that the Pokemon they did release later down the line were locked behind paid DLC? Okay, got it. Starting to make sense now. This change was so upsetting to see. The whole new animations was just a cheap excuse because the game was built on the same 3D models from X and Y. Yes, the same models they had been using for the past 6 years. And people were tired of these cheap animations. Most Pokemon just looked bland. They were just standing around and had no cool movement to them. Literally, compare the movement from Pokemon Stadium, a game that released 25 years ago, to this. Battle animations were also not impressive whatsoever. Again, this was fine on the 3DS when they had just made the move over to 3D for the first time, but this is a whole new system that is leagues above in terms of power compared to the 3DS. So why are we still getting the same 3DS quality animations? The answer is laziness. And before some of you start typing that the Switch hardware was a limitation and so on, look at Mario Odyssey. Look at Breath of the Wild. Even look at Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on the 3DS. Those games did so many crazy things. Even Pokemon Stadium on the Nintendo 64 had arguably better animations than this game. I also found the story of these games to be really disappointing and, like the game itself, rushed. Nothing really happens until the end when, spoiler alert for those who haven't played the game, Chairman Rose decides to reveal his true colors and sets Eternatus free, bringing upon the darkest day. I know it's hard to always come up with a unique twist, but this really felt like a cheap Lysandre ripoff. Bruh. Team Yell was also really boring. They weren't really an evil team, but just annoying hype men for Marnie, and I really think that in order for this climax to really hit, we needed some rising action. Look at Pokemon Emerald for example. The whole time we were fighting off both Team Aqua and Magma, we invade their hideouts and then they both released chaos upon the world with the legendary Pokemon. They really felt like a menacing threat. The only reason that the story felt as good as it did was because of the build-up we've been having along with those teams. Whereas this twist comes out of nowhere and doesn't really add anything unique to the story. Despite all of this seeming like a rant, I do gotta give credit where credit is due. Gamefreak still has it when it comes to Pokemon designs. I really enjoyed the new Pokemon. I think this generation introduced some really cool Pokemon, even some with some really unique type combos like Dragapult, Grimmsnarl, and the Appleton lines. And the one thing Gamefreak has that has never ever missed is the music. I really enjoyed the soundtrack to these games. And then Legends Arceus was announced, and I was so excited. Finally! An open world Pokemon game with new battle mechanics and animations. It was going to be set in Sinnoh, my favorite region, and despite the trainer looking a little rough, we knew gameplay wasn't finalized, and this looked like such a good concept. And then the game was released, and that's what it felt like, just a good concept. The game was open world, sure, but it still suffered from the same issues the Wild Area and Sword and Shield suffered from. The world was barren and didn't really have anything going for it. There was no reason to explore the various areas and the map just lacked diversity. Look at Pokemon Black and White. We had seasons, a cave that is charged with electricity, a different cave with a legendary Pokemon, multiple towns, each with their own charm and personality. Legends Arceus lacked all of this. We had one cave and it had literally nothing going on. Compare this with Elden Ring's open world. This game had so much content that you could easily miss if you just focused on the main story. There were dungeons, forests, castles, caves, mines, various bosses, and so much going on within the world, and the world was just memorable. It felt real. You really felt like you were in there. I played this game for over 100 hours and I still feel like there are areas where I have yet to explore. And sadly, I cannot say the same about Legends Arceus. The reason Elden Ring, Tears of the Kingdom, GTA, and other open world games are so highly regarded is because the world is actually lively. An open world game needs to have areas of interest and reward those players for going to those areas. Scarlet and Violet attempted this with the spears you release to encounter the legendaries, but I still think that wasn't enough to really make the players feel like it's worth their time. The game also looked like dog water, with Pokemon looking like a bad stop motion if you watched them from a distance. Pokemon would just roam around and not really interact with their environment, the same same issue that we had in Sword and Shield. And sure, there was some level of personality, but look at what they did with Pokemon Snap. Even the N64 version had Pokemon interacting with their environment more than a Switch game. So there is no way that the issue is hardware limitations. Then we had the graphics, which looked arguably worse than those on Sword and Shield. I know some of you will say it's just the art style, and sure, that can play a role, but there is no reason this game should look graphically worse than a GameCube game. Now, Pokemon games aren't known for their phenomenal story, but this game was just so repetitive. You would travel to the new area, catch some Pokemon to add to your deck, calm the frenzied Pokemon, and repeat this for all the areas. It literally felt like they coded this part of the game and just hit copy and paste over a few times just to pad out the game. And look, I know you can make this argument for every Pokemon game. You would visit a new town, defeat the gym leader, and then rinse and repeat. But the difference between those games is that there was a lot going on in between those gym battles. We had interesting environments, we had rival battles, we had encounters with the evil team, which this game just lacked. It isn't all negative though. I did enjoy the noble fights and how the player had to calm down the Pokemon before we could battle it. I also enjoyed how the wild Pokemon would attack the player and how the Pokemon were more true to size. And I also really like this new format Gamefreak is going with. And I do think this would make for some fun gameplay, but it just needs to have more time and care put into it. And that's kind of the biggest issue that I have with this video. Then we got the Diamond and Pearl remakes, which weren't handled by Gamefreak but rather ILCA. Regardless, they are still Pokemon games, so I'm going to cover them here too. As I stated before, Sinnoh is my favorite region in all of Pokemon, so seeing it get fumbled really hurt. My issue with these games is that they were literally just upscaled ports of Diamond and Pearl. Not Platinum, the better experience, but the original Diamond and Pearl. This means that they also suffered from the same issues that the original Diamond and Pearl had. For example, the lack of Fire-type Pokemon. In case you didn't know, the original Diamond and Pearl only had two options for Fire-type Pokemon, Rapidash and Infernape. So if you didn't pick Chimchar in the beginning, there isn't much of a choice to fill that spot. But you see, Platinum fixed this. It brought over Magmar, Slugma, Flareon, and one of my personal favorites, Houndour. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl did have these Pokemon available, but they were locked away in the Grand Underground Grottos and were only accessible when using certain statues in your base. So rather than just adjusting the regular map encounters, the developers wanted you to go through this long process just to solve an issue that Platinum had already solved. These are just some examples. Platinum also had a better story, gym leaders had stronger, more unique teams, the story had better pacing. There were just so many quality changes made to Platinum that made it the best Sinnoh experience, and yet despite this, ILCA decided to stick with the original Diamond and Pearl. Platinum had also brought back the Battle Frontier, which replaced the Battle Tower we had in Diamond and Pearl. This was a huge change for players looking for more of a challenge. The Battle Frontier had the original Battle Tower, along with 6 other buildings with their own unique battle moves. Now, would it surprise you to know that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl didn't have the Battle Frontier, but just the Battle Tower from the original games? And it's crazy, because Game Freak received a lot of backlash when they first released Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire with no Battle Frontier. That game had the Battle Mason from X and Y, which was a lot more simple than the Battle Frontier from Emerald. But the thing that sets ORAS apart from BDSP is that it was actually a proper remake with a lot of quality improvements over the original Ruby and Sapphire experience. First, it had an updated story that involved the introduction of Kyogre and Groudon's primal forms. It also introduced a Deck Snap, which was a fun way to encounter Pokemon with higher IVs, hidden abilities, and even shininess. It allowed you to fly all over Hoenn with your Mega Latios or Mega Latias, and it brought over previous Megas and even introduced new ones. And yet, despite not having a Battle Frontier, it had a phenomenal post-game where you literally go to space in Rayquaza to fight Deoxys. BDSP had none of this. Instead, we received the same post-game from Diamond and Pearl along with the ability to fight legendaries in Ramona's Park, and a super cool battle with Giratina in the Distortion World. No, we don't get to roam around there. Not including the Distortion World in the game was such a fumble. I remember seeing the Giratina movie when I was a kid and obsessing over the Distortion World. Then we had the chance to go there in Platinum and do some clever puzzles with the Lake Trio. This is just such a missed opportunity. In my opinion, I believe that a remake should be the definitive way to experience that game. Look at Pokemon Gold and Silver. Everyone would much rather play Heart Gold and Soul Silver just because the quality changes and improvements that came along with it. And I sadly can't say that BDSP is the superior Sinnoh experience. Its only redeeming value is that it's readily available on the Switch, and Platinum is just really expensive nowadays. Then we got the latest game in the franchise, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and you guys have seen the memes. This game was just so badly optimized and it just ran horribly. I don't mind the occasional frame drop, but when the game feels unplayable or you lose immersion due to the frame drops, then that right there is an issue. This game also had the same issues as all the other games with the Pokemon in the overworld, where Pokemon just roam around and don't really interact with their environment or each other. The Pokemon Snap remake on the Switch did this perfectly, and I know it's easier to program this since you are kind of on a set track looking at set interactions, but I still think that they can find a way to implement something like this in their other games. Another area that was absent in all of these games is a proper post-game. Look, X and Y had the whole storyline with Looker where you help him investigate certain cases. Omega Ruby had a Delta chapter where you end up going to space and fighting Deoxys. Scarlet and Violet had nothing going on besides gym leader rematches and Terra raid battles. It really feels like they just cut out the post game, expanded on it, and then sold it to you a little bit later as paid DLC. Pokemon Legends ZA is releasing very soon, and although I'm optimistic, I won't be surprised if it's just another disappointment. Just from looking at the trailers, it looks like they took a step back and brought back the wild area, except this time, they put it in Lumio City instead of the Galar region. Gamefreak also has decided to put these fences with levels around the areas where Pokemon spawn in the city, which I don't like since it just breaks immersion in my opinion. Just have the Pokemon there. Or even better, have the wild Pokemon roam the city, instead of them only having like a designated corral. Some of the Pokemon here look less NPC-like. In the trailer you can see a Trubbish and a Gerborder in an alley, so I wonder if they are working towards fixing this NPC-like issue. But then again, there are other Pokemon that are literally just standing there, so who really knows? But I also want to talk about the animations, because there is no reason that a game releasing in 2025 should use the same cutscene transition to a different part of the map as GTA San Andreas. Okay, maybe not the same, but you guys see the resemblance, right? I'm also worried about the game only taking place in Lumio City. Previous titles have already had issues with repetitive assets and textures, so it's going to be really easy for Gamefreak to just hit copy paste all over again. There's also the issue about the diverse environments. If it's all in Lumio City, I'm worried that it's going to be all pretty much the same, and it's going to be another Legends Arceus situation where the game just kind of got boring and repetitive. But then again, I could be wrong, who knows? I really believe that all that Game Freak needs to do is just allocate more time into their games and take notes from other games in the industry that have been positively received. They knew fans wanted an open world game and they gave it to us, but I don't think they realized what about an open world game people like. It's clear that they have good ideas, but they're just not fleshed out since they are putting out a new game every so often. All they need to do is have more time and more passion into these projects. And look, I'm not a developer, but if other games can do this, I believe the highest grossing franchise can do this as well. Thank you all so much for watching, it really means the world to me. If any of you guys feel any different about the opinions that I shared, please comment them down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Again, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I'm just overall disappointed in the Switch lineup of games we received. I just really want Pokemon to be the franchise that I know it can be.